So there's this channel on YouTube called Feeble King that claims that the Dark Souls games are better at level 1. And I'd never beaten any of the games at level 1 before this video, but he made a pretty compelling argument, so I wanted to try it. And I'm going to review all the bosses and tell you whether being level 1 makes them better or not. I'm going to cover the bosses in the normal order they're beaten. I did them in a slightly different order in my run. I'm just going to say that now to avoid confusion and so people don't think I'm cheating and go down in the comments section and, you know. Also, I'm playing as my girlfriend because I guess I like to see her die a lot. Like, a lot. This video took a really long time to make and more importantly write, so if you enjoy it, subscribe. This is a pretty decent starting boss. It has well telegraphed attacks, it hits pretty hard, but it's easy enough that a new player should be able to beat him without too much trouble. It's also quite good at teaching the fundamentals of rolling through attacks and waiting for when the attack is actually going to happen to dodge, rather than just reflexively rolling when the attack is telegraphed. Phase 2 is also good and arguably easier than Phase 1, but it's harder to tell what's going to hurt you and what isn't, and what is an attack and what is just the beast writhing around. Still, it works quite well, and when something that does major damage is being thrown out, you know about it. It's a good introduction that provides a mix of beast and swordsman boss types, and is also parryable, which is really cool for returning players. Obviously, being level 1 doesn't really factor into this boss fight, as you have to do it at level 1, so there's nothing to really say about that. A decent second boss with well telegraphed attacks. He goes down pretty fast because he gives you a lot of time to attack him during his phase transition. He has some problems with getting stuck on his hitbox, especially since it's so easy to get underneath him and then you get pushed along by his belly. It's sort of a theme with a lot of the beast bosses, and it's kind of problematic since the best strategy against them is to get underneath them, which puts you in the perfect position to get dragged along by their hitbox. It's fairly minimal in the grand scheme of things, but you do feel cheated out of a death when it does happen. Also, the room he's in is a little small for how big he is. Like, he's quite a sizable, chunky boy, and this room is little, and it gives you awkward camera angles at times, especially if you end up fighting him up against a wall or at the back of the arena where it's slightly thinner than it is in the rest of the room. His moveset is mostly comprised of slow, well telegraphed attacks with very clear punish windows, and he has very few mix-ups thrown in for phase 2. He has a charge and an ice breath that are added. His only attack that I really take issue with is this one where, despite attacking in front of him, also hits below him, which is normally where you're standing. While I'm completely fine with an attack that punishes players for just sitting below him all the time, I think it should have been telegraphed better, since you can't really tell it's going to hit you unless you've been hit by it before. Level 1 doesn't really factor into this fight at all, since you get so few levels between Gundyr and Vordt that your damage is basically the same. This is just a very subpar boss all around. He's large, unwieldy, and not a super interesting fight mechanically. Second phase has its share of jank, with the hand being poorly telegraphed and the fact that you just have to wait for him to fall over to slash at certain weak points. It doesn't feel like a Dark Souls boss since it's so gimmick based and doesn't engage with any of the nuances of the combat system. The fight is so simple, it's basically just running between different spots and slashing a couple of times, even at level 1. It's just sort of in the way of progressing, and I'd probably skip it more often if he didn't drop the transposing kiln, which you need to get boss items. Fortunately, it doesn't last very long and isn't even very hard on level 1, although I did come back when it was wildly overleveled, but the fact that I put it off for so long is probably testament to how much of a chore it is to do. Another highly mediocre boss with a very weak phase 1 and then a huge spike in difficulty for phase 2, neither of which are particularly challenging, but when they do kill you, it's extremely frustrating. Phase 1 basically boils down to running to the sage and wailing on him until he teleports, and phase 2 is a mad scramble to avoid magic attacks and take out the sage clones before you get overwhelmed, which in theory sounds kind of enjoyable, but in practice is just exhausting, as most of your deaths come from magic attacks that fly in from off the screen as you're dealing with something else. When doing this at soul level 1, it's arguably worse, as you can survive fewer attacks, making the awkward design of this boss that much more noticeable. It's a small gimmick boss that exemplifies the weak first half of Dark Souls 3 well by primarily being underwhelming. The one redeeming factor of this boss is that the design of the sage is really cool, and you can buy his hat after beating him. Not a terrible gimmick boss, but a really easy one. In my opinion, the easiest boss in the game. Some people will probably say Wolnir, but I'll get into why I don't agree when we talk about him. This boss involves circling around a large group of enemies and killing the one with a red aura that does damage to the boss health bar. After killing a few of these, the special Deacon will spawn alongside a few bodyguards, and he will be the only special Deacon for the rest of the fight. While it's kind of entertaining to kite around this huge group, generally you can kill the Deacons in 1 or 2 hits. So the first phase goes down really fast, and then phase 2 is a massive pushover, since you can get most of your damage in while the special Deacon is spawning in. Even on my level 1 run, this fight was a joke. Visually, it's a really cool fight, and it's kind of an interesting gimmick, but it quickly loses its charm after you've beaten it before and just becomes something that you forgot existed until you get to Irithyll and find out you can't go through the invisible wall. It's kind of a shame that this boss is weak since it's in a really well-designed area. Considering the lore implications of the Deacons, it almost feels like this is where you should have fought Aldrich, but it isn't that big of a deal since the area is still enjoyable in its own right. This is a really excellent boss that takes inspiration from what is probably the best boss in Dark Souls 1, Artorias. It has incredible environmental storytelling, with the Watchers fighting each other and the black on their cloak representing how they've been corrupted by the Abyss. It's a great example of narrative and gameplay being interwoven in the classic Dark Souls style. Second phase marks a very polished swordsman boss with some tricky lingering hitboxes that mix up the formula and punish habits. Second phase could do with having some more close range combos, since the one combo that he tends to do is really easily punishable, even on SL1, but that's likely the result of it being a boss that's relatively early on, and giving them combos like that of Lorien would have made them too hard. Either way though, this boss is a benchmark of the polish expected from Dark Souls 3, and it's a boss that stands head and shoulders above the rest of the early game. This is more of a spectacle fight than anything else. Most of his difficulty comes from intimidation, which is lost when the player realizes how easy he is. You just need to slash his bracelets a few times each, which is super easy because he barely puts up any resistance to prevent you from doing so. He has a total of like 4 attacks, 3 of which you almost never see because the fight is over too quickly. The most difficult part of this boss isn't the boss itself, but the insta-kill fog right behind him, which can hit you quite easily if you aren't careful, since the boundary of where you start taking damage really isn't clear. The fight is literally identical on Soul Level 1 as it is on a regular playthrough, which probably says something about its difficulty. It's an okay spectacle, but overall a very underwhelming boss. My opinion on this boss did a complete 180 after doing my level 1 run. Before doing SL1, I thought this fight was alright. He has a series of relatively slow attacks, some kind of strange AoEs, and a sort of odd firing attack which I didn't really know how to dodge, but apart from that, it was fine. Then I did level 1, and my god, this boss is just terrible. Since you have such low health at level 1, everything just one-shots you. So you notice his flaws way more, and they are everywhere with old Demon King. His hitboxes are jank, he turns incredibly fast, and you can get stuck on him really easily. Also, those AoE attacks that I thought weren't a problem make this fight an ordeal, as you have to constantly run away and play as safe as possible so you don't just die instantly because there's no way to directly deal with them. I hated this fight so much that I actually left it and came back before the final boss of the run to beat it. This does highlight something interesting about SL1 though. It has an ability to uncover when something is sloppy. If attacks are janky or annoying, you will find out because the fight lasts so long and you have such little health that you have to deal with every attack the boss has at some point. Normally on a level 1 run, you would parry Pontiff, since that's the easiest way to kill him, but I thought that wouldn't be in the spirit of the run, as I wouldn't really have to deal with much of his moveset since the fight would end so much faster. Like, look at this. And it's over, just like that. So I chose to fight him just dodging. Phase 1 is a really great one-on-one swordsman fight with a wide range of attacks and combos that are constantly being mixed up. He also has a good mix of fast and delayed attacks that keeps the player's attention on his animations. He's also the first time Dark Souls 3's signature hyper-aggressive boss design becomes noticeable, as Pontiff will constantly approach you if you try to run away, and has combo extenders upon combo extenders that you have to look out for. This, however, doesn't impede on your damage windows. If you can dodge his attacks properly, you have plenty of time to deal damage. Phase 1 Pontiff also forces the player to fight him at point blank by making it extremely difficult to stay at range due to his constant aggression, fast and heavily damaging dash attacks, and combos that will take him across the entire room. Phase 2 is where he gets a lot messier, however. Pontiff spawns a shadow clone like fucking Naruto that attacks before him, telegraphing what the real Pontiff will do. He also has a slightly different moveset in this phase, with more slow ranged attacks. This marks a jarring pace change in the fight, as your strategy needs to take a complete 180 as the player. You need to play far more passive and at a distance in this phase, especially at level 1, since you can't just burn down the shadow like normal. I think this slower pace, while still interesting, isn't as engaging as the first phase, but what really lets this phase down is the jank that it introduces. Sometimes, and I mean sometimes because it's kind of rare, real Pontiff and Shadow Pontiff can desync, causing them to do different attacks at the same time, different attacks at different times, or whatever combination. You can get stun locked from this relatively easily with some poor luck, and it feels super cheap when it happens. Overall, I still think this boss is better at level 1, but it does have some sloppiness to it. This boss is a brilliant spectacle with amazing visual design and is overall a decent gimmick boss as gimmick bosses go, but does lose a lot of its charm on repeat playthroughs. Yhorm involves using the Storm Ruler, which fires a massive gust of wind and can be picked up at the back of his boss room. While this is a really cool idea, I'd much rather the Storm Ruler just be automatically equipped rather than having to open your menu mid-fight and equip it, which is much less elegant. The fight itself isn't anything super special. While it's fun and a cool spectacle the first time, Yhorm doesn't really have many moves, and that very quickly becomes apparent as the fight goes on. Fortunately though, the fight really doesn't go on for that long. The Storm Ruler absolutely destroys him, even at level 1, and for me and most people, he probably went down before really doing very much. He does have some cool lore though, and if you do Siegward's side quest, you can fight the boss with Siegward, which is a cute little addition, and interestingly, the only time in a Souls game that you could have somebody else in a boss fight without summoning them. Aldrich is a very feast or famine boss, and whether you feast or famine is entirely dependent on his arrow attack and how much he uses it. This arrow attack is probably the only reason Aldrich is difficult for anyone, since the rest of his moveset is a joke, with incredibly long windups, minimal damage, or just him outright missing. Despite how RNG dependent I may have made it seem with that statement, with your success being based on a single attack, you can make him consistent by positioning correctly and quickly running to him after he teleports. This isn't 100%, he can still do the attack, but it's far, far less common than if you were to be further away. Because of the limited moveset and oppressive nature of the arrow attack, most of this fight devolves into wailing on him until he teleports, at which point there's a mad scramble to get close to him again. Despite all of this, I find myself strangely enjoying this fight, and I think it's purely because of how aggressively his body shakes around when you hit it. It gives such weight to all your attacks, and to me it has the same kind of appeal as Bloodborne's visceral attacks. What is kind of a shame though is Aldrich being the boss of the beautiful and nostalgic Anor Londo, and yeah, it's cool to see that he ate some of the characters from the first game, but I always felt it would have been more impactful here to have fought the Nameless King or something. Not terrible, just a little underwhelming, which appears to be a theme of early Dark Souls 3. A boss designed around having really unique timings and animations that imitate a dancer's. It makes the fight really engaging, as you have to hone in on her attack animations and at times suppress your muscle memory and instead dodge at slightly odd timings. This is even more relevant at level 1, as she does an astronomical amount of damage, especially at this point in the run, since any health and weapon upgrades for level 1 are locked behind her, literally forcing you to just get good and learn her patterns. Fortunately, they are a joy to learn, and if you master fighting the dancer, it's enormously satisfying, as you can effortlessly dodge massive combos and fast attacks. The only real criticism I have with this boss is how the different phases are balanced. In phase 1, Dancer is really passive, generally attacking infrequently and usually only throwing out a single attack when she does, but in phase 2 it's the absolute opposite. After pulling out a second sword, she immediately opens with her massive Spin of Doom attack and continues to be hyper hyper aggressive for the rest of the fight, with tons of combos and AoEs. I just think it would have been a slightly better fight overall if rather than having an extreme spike in phase 2, phase 1 was slightly more aggressive, maybe with shortened versions of phase 2 combos, and then in phase 2 she was slightly less aggressive to make up for the increase in phase 1. I said phase like 40 times there, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. More even difficulty curve across the fight, because right now it looks like this. This is also about the point where fights in a level 1 run start to play notably different than they would in a regular run. As for Dancer at level 1 versus regular, I would say she's very slightly improved. It's not a massive difference, but she has more opportunities to throw out attacks in phase 1 since it lasts a little longer, and this does do something to remedy my issues with the boss normally. This is another one of those bosses similar to Aldrich that really hinges on a single attack that drags the boss down. This time it's a charge attack, which if you know FromSoft's history with charge attacks is probably gonna be bad. His charge is so unbelievably jank. It comes out incredibly fast and has a massive hitbox, plus at level 1 it can easily one-shot you, which is a nightmare combination. Fortunately, the rest of his moveset isn't nearly as problematic, with a series of swings and jumps in his first phase and spins and crystal attacks in his second. It really is just that one charge attack that weighs this boss down mechanically. Aside from that though, Oceiros actually has a unique aspect to his presentation, that being his dialogue. He's the only boss out of all the Souls games to speak during the boss fight, and it's great. His insane rambling about his invisible baby, which he slams into the ground halfway through the fight, is super weird and entertaining, and is genuinely the only reason that this boss doesn't feel like a chore to me. It's just a shame that his charge is so stupid and one-shots you at level 1, otherwise I'd say this fight was improved, but I think it's slightly more enjoyable on a regular playthrough. This boss took me a long time at level 1, and he's essential to beat if you're doing this run, since the boss's soul transposes into the prisoner's chain, which is kind of the most important item for a level 1 run. It increases your vigor, endurance, and vitality by 5, so it wasn't like I could go do something else and come back. Despite how much of a wall he was for me, I still think this boss is absolutely brilliant, and honestly his difficulty just adds to that feeling. In my mind, Champion Gundyr is simple perfection personified. He's everything you want out of an excellent Dark Souls boss. A balanced and varied moveset, high aggression, clear damage windows, and he's parryable, which I didn't do for my level 1 run, but the option is there and it looks really satisfying. If you aren't parrying the champ, I think he is improved by a level 1 run, simply because you get to see more of what he can do. Over the 2 hours it took me to beat him, he constantly surprised me with mix-ups that I'd never seen before in 5 playthroughs of the game, and it was genuinely incredibly satisfying to master his moveset and the timings to dodge all of his attacks, something that a regular playthrough clearly hadn't required me to do. The one real downside of this boss is that he's maybe a little too simple. He lacks the defining feature that a lot of the other great bosses in this game have. You could probably argue that his fighting game style combos in phase 2 are his defining feature, but I don't think they really factor into the fight as much as they would need to for that. Either way, he's a really good boss that scared the shit out of me, as I knew there was harder stuff to come. This is another really strong boss in the endgame of Dark Souls 3, which is gonna happen a lot because all of the endgame bosses in Dark Souls 3 are incredible. Dragonslayer Armour is fairly standard as fights with a big guy in armor go. A few faster swipe combos, some slower, much heavier attacks, and a series of fast shield bashes that are really hard to dodge. It's another boss that is really well executed, but simple, in a similar way to the champ. His phase 2 switch up adds projectiles flying in from the sides of the arena that you have to dodge while fighting a powered up Dragonslayer Armour with a few extra attacks, like this sweep where he sticks his axe into the ground, which has really difficult timing to dodge. This is where I think the fight falters a little bit. The whole projectile thing is really underwhelming for phase 2, as it adds very little to the fight even at level 1. When these attacks would probably do considerable damage, they never even factored into the fight. They're so slow and miss so often that I can imagine many casual players probably didn't even know they were a part of the fight. Speaking of Dragonslayer at level 1, it's surprisingly similar to normal. I destroyed him in this run in 3 attempts, and when I did kill him, I only took a single hit. Maybe it was because I had a plus 10 weapon, or maybe it was because I just fought the champ, who's much harder, but it was a little odd that I took him down that fast in a run that's supposed to make the game harder. Either way, I think this boss is still slightly improved at level 1, just because the fight is usually even shorter than this, and at least the projectiles present somewhat of a threat to your low health. I just wish phase 2 lent more more into charging up how the armor fights itself rather than projectile spam, because I'm pretty sure falling off the side of the arena poses more of a threat. Another really excellent boss on the back end of Dark Souls 3, this time with a couple of unique gimmicks. In Phase 1, it's essentially another swordsman fight, except the swordsman can teleport, which is a concept that is seemingly complex but was executed perfectly. The teleports are very easy to follow since the camera stays locked on the whole time, meaning you aren't struggling to follow your enemy's movements with the camera. Because of this one decision, the teleportation gimmick that could have been really frustrating becomes incredibly engaging, as you have to quickly read and react to the attack thrown out after the teleport, and the dodge timings for some of these can be really rough, especially the one where Lorien falls out of the air. This fight also manages to have a really great rhythm to it, with you dodging a few close attacks and then getting in some hits, and then dodging a teleport attack or a ranged attack. In Phase 2, you're faced with another mix-up. Lothric resurrects his brother and attaches himself to his back, where he fires off occasional magic attacks, but the real mix-up is how you have to deal damage, where in Phase 1 you could just hit Lorien anywhere. To beat Phase 2, you need to target your attacks on Lothric, who's on Lorien's back. If you don't and just kill Lorien, Lothric will just continually resurrect his brother. This is a brilliant addition to the fight, as it mixes up the established rhythm you have with the boss, forcing you to more carefully select your damage windows. Despite how many things this boss does, it never once feels unfair, likely owing to the incredibly well telegraphed attacks. And yes, predictably, this boss is greatly improved at level 1. In a normal playthrough, you can blow through this boss pretty fast, so having to survive longer gives more time for the rhythm of the fight to really set in. It's an incredibly engrossing boss to fight, and I really enjoy it every time I play the game, whether it's at level 1 or not. This boss was unbelievably hard at level 1. It was by far the hardest boss for me. It wasn't even close. Soul of Cinder took me 6 hours to beat, something like 140 attempts. This was actually a massive surprise for me, since I had never really had a problem with him in a normal playthrough, and because of that, I think it's really one of those bosses in the game that benefits the most from being fought at level 1. It also kind of led me to another conclusion about level 1 runs and how they improve bosses. It seems like the more complex the design of the boss, the more you get out of beating them at level 1. For Cinder, this is clearly in effect. He possesses an enormous number of moves across his 4 weapons in Phase 1 and new moveset in Phase 2, most of which you don't really have to deal with or understand in normal playthrough, which is a massive shame because everything in his arsenal is meticulously crafted. Over the 6 hours that I fought this boss, I wasn't angry or anything. I really enjoyed it, which I think is just because at no point did I feel like the fight was unfair at all, similar to the princes. When I died, it felt like my fault, and as I kept going, I could see tangible progress as I optimized my movement, got hit less, and did more damage. The fight itself is brilliant. It's genuinely a masterpiece, both in presentation and gameplay. Cinder is the amalgamation of every player to Link the Fire. So in Phase 1, he fights with various weapons representing different builds, all of which have unique movesets. The only real complaint I have about this phase, which is also the only complaint I have about the whole boss, is that his curved sword / pyromancer build is just too fast. It makes it pretty much impossible to fight, especially at level 1. In fact, I just ran away whenever he pulled out the curved sword. It's not a huge complaint because it doesn't last all that long in the grand scheme of things, but if it were more balanced, it would be better. After draining his entire health bar, he switches to Phase 2 while completely restoring his health. In a brilliant artistic choice from the developers, he gains an amped up version of Gwyn's moveset from Dark Souls 1, along with a variation of his iconic theme. All of this culminates in a boss fight that represents everything great about Dark Souls. Its wordless storytelling, incredible presentation, absurd attention to detail, and flawless gameplay. Soul of Cinder is a beautiful send-off to a series that is incredibly important to video games as a medium, and is testament to the hard work done by some of the greatest talents in the industry. However, there is a boss that surpasses it, somehow, which I'll get to later. Do I really need to talk about this boss? It sucks on a normal run, it's worse on level 1. The enemies are annoying, the boss dies in one hit, it's just a roadblock to the actual good boss of the area. Also, this happened to me on my level 1 run. I was so mad when that happened, like, just so annoyed, and I always fail this boss. I always do that thing where you jump down where his head is still moving and you just die from fall damage. You know, everyone's done that once if you played this game before. I do that like every single time. So to get screwed over in this oddly specific way, and I'd been playing for like 4 hours already, I'm just gonna move on. We're gonna move on. I really like fighting this boss at level 1. It's a fight that just feels perfectly tuned for the amount of health you have and damage you can do. Nameless King does just the right amount of damage that you can tank one of his weaker hits without dying, and that's enough of a margin of error to make the fight highly challenging, but not brutally or overly difficult. In phase 1, you fight King of the Storms, which is the dragon that the good part of the boss is riding. King of the Storms is just okay. It's not hugely terrible, and if you're doing SL1 you get very familiar with it, so it's not a huge problem, but I also kind of feel like maybe after you kill him the first time, King of the Storms should just stay dead, and when you go back into the boss room you start from phase 2, but that would make the fight a lot easier, which isn't necessarily what I want. Still though, King of the Storms isn't exactly the most interesting or mechanically challenging fight, with a very small moveset and health pool, plus he does a considerable amount of stalling with his fire breath, which just artificially lengthens the fight. I think a lot of people here would be complaining about the camera and how awkward it is to see his attacks coming, but I honestly kind of think that's a skill issue. I managed to make it really consistent after a few attempts, and it's not that bad. I don't have a real conclusion on what would be best to do here, since I don't want this part of the fight to disappear completely, but I still don't think it's perfect. Phase 2, however, is pretty much perfect. It's a brilliant one-on-one swordsman fight with the estranged son of Gwyn that is hard as nails, with incredible tight and varied dodge timings and small damage windows. This phase 2 also has a phase 2 of its own, as at half health the Nameless King will gain a few new AoE attacks with incredibly tight timings and a delayed lightning strike, which doubles up as both his biggest damage window and deadliest attack. That attack in particular I think is really well designed, since it balances out the difficulty of dodging it with a lot of free hits on the boss, and if you aren't confident about the timing, you can always not go for the punish and focus on dodging. It's just a nice little risk-reward element to the fight. At level 1, you have to deal with all of this. There's really no getting around it. You almost do no damage to this boss, so you need to be able to dodge all of his attacks. Fortunately, it's an absolute joy to learn his patterns, and despite it taking me a couple of hours to finally beat him, I enjoyed every second of it. Even this heartbreaking attempt where I died one hit away felt really good, since I knew I could do it. Wow, it's an NPC boss in a Souls game. Those have such a great history of being so great and fun and not terrible. No, but really the champion Gravetender isn't that bad, as NPCs fights go at least. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not great, but it's not DS2 Gank Squad level. Either way, champion Gravetender is a fairly simplistic fight that seems to lack an identity. Like it was just an afterthought thrown into the DLC as a way to introduce new PvP content and a weapon. The fight itself starts off with a scramble to kill the Gravetender's dogs, which is a less than subtle attempt at artificially making the fight more difficult. But I kind of get it, since when you do get to fight the Gravetender by himself, it's not hugely mechanically engaging, as his AI can be manipulated pretty easily. Like, look at what I did to him. Being at level 1 really wasn't an issue when I could just backstab him over and over. On the upside though, backstabbing him is pretty satisfying. After you get the Gravetender low, he'll change to magic attacks and summon a large wolf, making this a duo fight. This isn't a very well thought out duo fight. I really don't think the movesets of these two complement each other at all, with the wolf constantly jumping around the arena out of sight and the two of them buddying up waiting to stunlock you. When you do finally take out the Gravetender, the wolf alone isn't that great of a fight either. He doesn't have a very large moveset, just a series of bites and dashes, and this incredibly obnoxious ice breath attack with a huge janky hitbox that one-shots you at level 1. Despite how much I just contemned this boss though, I still think it's a little better at level 1 than it is normally, just because I had to engage my brain when doing it. On a normal playthrough, you would be so strong at this point in the game that you could just destroy the boss, stunlocking Gravetender and sometimes even killing him before the wolf comes out, and then doing a very similar thing to the wolf. It's a boss that suffers from not feeling super well thought out, and in the end just turns out bland. This is another boss that really benefits from a level 1 run due to its complexity and length. Across her 3 phases, Friede possesses an enormous moveset and some really unique mechanics that you wouldn't necessarily have to engage with in a normal run due to her relatively low health. But that low health actually works to the boss's benefit at level 1, since it prevents the fight from being overly long and a slog. However, the fight itself is brilliant even on a normal run, using both the one-on-one sword fight and multi-boss format. This fight also has an X factor that mixes up the standard combat formula, and it comes in the form of Friede's insane recovery time, meaning she can act very quickly after an attack or getting hit, making it very difficult to punish her. It means you have to change up your playstyle from always just being dodge and hit, and forces the player to really familiarize themselves with Friede's moveset and which attacks can be punished in time. She also has an invincibility attack in phases 1 and 3, which is a homage to Priscilla in Dark Souls 1, and is done much better this time, with the player locating her using sound rather than footsteps in the snow. This takes a little while to get used to, but is enormously rewarding when you do, since it gives you a massive damage window and an opportunity to backstab her. Additionally, phase 2 is a very successful take on a duo boss, with the combination of the fast and slow archetypes of Ornstein and Smo, and the ranged and melee of the Demon Prince. This phase is mostly an exercise in focusing down Father Ariandel while carefully positioning to dodge Friede's highly damaging ranged ice attacks and keeping an eye on her to prevent her heal from going off. The only issue I have with this fight is it does kind of feel pandering, as Friede's sudden change from being very aggressive in phase 1 to really passive in phase 2 is a little jarring. Although I guess that could just be chalked up to if she attacked you more, she'd also be hitting Father Ariandel, which you wouldn't want to do, but overall it works exceptionally well, and it's a smart way to balance out a duo boss with 2 seemingly uncomplementary movesets. After taking out phase 2, you get to the 3rd and final phase, which is by far the hardest. Black Flame Friede is a massive expansion on the ideas of phase 1, with a giant list of new moves, combos, and ranged attacks. She also has a new take on her phase 1 invisibility attack, where she dodges 3 times while throwing out ice attacks and finishes with a black flame attack that does massive damage. This attack is the only real one that I don't absolutely love, since it's trivially easy to track her movements if you pay attention to the first jump, and kind of just feels like a shoehorn change rather than evolution of the mechanic from the first phase. The majority of the rest of her moves are massive combo strings that can easily kill you if you don't dodge correctly, and jumping attacks that are your main window for damage. Despite being really aggressive, she throws in enough attacks that can be punished that you aren't just dodging endlessly, and her low health and poise is still her weakness, so she can be relatively easily stun locked for 2 or 3 hits. This boss is brilliant and manages to really test the player's endurance while being varied enough that it doesn't become boring. The best duo boss FromSoftware has ever made, and a very clear example of how far they've come since Dark Souls 1. Some people might disagree with that comment, citing Ornstein and Smo as the best duo boss, and while I think there's an argument to be made for that, especially when focusing on lore and presentation, mechanically I think the Demon Princes are considerably better. First phase is a duo boss with the Demon in Pain and Demon from Below, both of which having identical movesets. What's interesting about this boss though is that you only really fight one at a time. One demon will be highly aggressive and attack with fast melee attacks, and the other shoots ranged toxic attacks that are slow and well telegraphed, but mean you have to consider your positioning more carefully when fighting the aggressive one. They switch aggressive and passive states on a timer, which generally means you do around half the health of each one of them before they swap out on a normal run, and on level 1 you do a lot less than that. Sometimes this results in both bosses being aggressive for a short period, or both being passive for a short period, which is unpredictable and forces the player to reactively change their playstyle. But occasionally this can be to the boss's detriment, as the overlapping states can last too long and mean you're just stuck running away for like 2 minutes. The boss only enters phase 2 once both of them are dead, at which point the last one you killed will revive as the Demon Prince and gain a much larger, vastly more damaging moveset. Depending on which you killed last, you can either get the Laser or Meteor Demon, which play very differently. the Laser Demon is the much easier of the two, so it's what I chose to fight for my level 1 run. He has far fewer AoEs, lower damage attacks, and a really slow laser move, which gives you a massive damage window. The Meteor Demon is considerably harder, with many massive AoEs and a charged Meteor Storm that's incredibly difficult to dodge without being under the boss itself. However, if you're using Alluring Skulls, you can absolutely trivialize the Meteor Demon, rendering the strong parts of his moveset useless. I could have done this for my level 1 run, but I chose not to, since it's sort of on the borderlines of cheesing the boss. Both of these do play really well though, and are closer in difficulty than they may appear, but I still would prefer if there was a better balance struck between the two, with both of them being around the same difficulty rather than one being harder and one being easier. This boss is also in an area that I absolutely love, the Dreg Heap, which is essentially a massive pile of rubble which contains remnants of structures from Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and is beautifully bleak. Fuck this boss. Now earlier I said that I didn't get mad after 6 hours of fighting Soul of Cinder, so I think it says something that it only took me 3 attempts to lose my shit at this boss and completely rework my strategy so I could cheese the shit out of him. I went with the big sword charge R2 method for those who are familiar, which may have been the wrong choice in retrospect since it was still a nightmare. Halflight is another NPC boss fight, the worst of the two in Dark Souls 3, but it's actually intended to be completely different. If you play online for this fight, which I didn't for obvious reasons, a real player invades instead of the NPC, which is kind of an interesting idea, and I could see it being fun if you like PvP. But they also decided to add random painting guardians to fight alongside the hostile player, which makes it really one-sided. Plus, the painting guardians have the most obnoxious moveset, full of homing projectiles and heals that basically undo your progress. If you play offline, you fight Halflight, an NPC that wields the frayed blade and a bow, and swaps between two-handing the sword, using a sword and shield together, and just using the bow, each of which gives him access to different moves, kind of like how Soul of Cinder works, but much less interesting since his moveset wasn't specifically designed to be fought by the player, it's just the regular moves of the weapons he's wielding. So what you end up getting is an awkward, janky PvP fight with an enemy that has infinite stamina, infinite FP, and minions that he can summon to heal him. It's possible in a normal run since you do enough damage that you can just blast through both Halflight and the Painting Guardians, but at level 1 it's excruciating. I will never understand why Midir is the optional boss in this DLC and not Halflight. It makes no sense to me, and it's one of the few bosses in Dark Souls 3 that is worse at level 1 simply because you can trivialize it on a normal run. Another really great level 1 boss, and by far the best dragon boss or enemy in the series. I think the main reason that Midir sets itself apart from the other dragon bosses in the series is the way you're intended to fight him. Unlike the other dragons or even animal/beast bosses, Midir is meant to be fought head on, attacking his head and dodging attacks from the front, unlike the usual strategy for a boss of this scale, which involves exploiting their size to get in damage and avoiding attacks by staying underneath them. This simply doesn't work for Midir. He has too many attacks that are near unavoidable if you just hit his legs or feet, plus you do an absolutely minuscule amount of damage to them. This decision to step away from the status quo of dragon boss formats was the absolute best they could have made, as it opened the door for a much more engaging fight that's a back and forth of attacking and dodging, similar to a swordsman rather than just staring at a scaly inner thigh for a few minutes. So mechanically it feels quite unique, as it switches from dodging quick slash combos like you're fighting a swordsman to carefully positioning around large AoEs and charges, which is more similar to a generic dragon or beast fight. It manages to mix and match elements from different boss formulas and executes them individually really well, with great telegraphing and hitboxes, especially the fire hitboxes, which for the first time are actually really good in a Souls game. They don't linger for too long, they aren't too wide or bounce all over the place, they just function as intended and function consistently. There's no longer a worry of being bullshitted by the fire hitboxes, so you're confident in punishing the attacks instead of just waiting around, and as a result it doesn't interrupt that back and forth that works so well. He also moves around a lot, like all the time. He can easily cross the whole arena multiple times over the course of the fight with his charge attack and flying attack. And because of how much he moves, there's a lot of opportunity to optimize your positioning, which is something that is only really relevant in level 1 runs. Taking slightly different paths when chasing the boss or avoiding attacks to end up in the perfect spot for a punish can reward you with a few extra hits each time Midir repositions, which seems pretty minimal, but when the fight takes as long as it does at level 1, those small improvements points really add up and make a considerable difference. It's just a little bit of extra depth that I wouldn't have engaged with if I weren't playing the game at level 1. He also has his iconic laser beam attack, which lots of people take issue with due to its astronomically high damage, easily one-shotting properly leveled characters. Personally, I don't have a problem with it, and I think those who do are fighting the boss wrong. The thing is, the attack is only hard to dodge if you're far away. If you're close, it's really simple. You just run underneath him. I think the attack is intentionally designed to be bullshit for people who are far away. It's FromSoft's way of telling you that you're fighting the boss wrong and you need to get closer. It even rewards you with a pretty sizable damage window if you do dodge it correctly. I absolutely loved fighting this boss at level 1. It felt considerably different from normal, as I was far more focused on really optimizing the way I played to do the maximum amount of damage I could, rather than normal where you can kind of just tank everything and run wherever you want and get away with it. The final boss of the final DLC is Gael, an undead from before the time of Gwyn, who has killed the Pygmy Lords and consumed their blood, causing him to go insane. So you, a person he found in a chapel and tricked into entering the painted world of Ariamis, can eventually kill him and deliver the blood of the Dark Soul to a painter who will use it to create a new world.
My thanks, Ashen One. With this will I paint a world. Please tell me thy name. I would name this painting after thee. I see. We are much alike. Then I will name this painting Ash. It will be a cold, dark, and very gentle place. And one day, it will make someone a goodly home.
It's an incredibly touching story that is not really unlike your own. You, as the player, have fought across all of time in a vain attempt to end the cycle of fire that plagues the world, and while Gael's end goal may be different, his motives are the same. He sees the world as beyond saving, a place so rotten and cursed from the core that the best way forward would be to create a new world entirely. Gael is another 3-phase boss like Friede, but this time all 3 phases are on one really long health bar. I like this a little more than the constantly refilling of Friede's health bar. It was fun the first time being psyched out after phase 2 and finding out she had a secret 3rd phase, but it's much easier to judge how much you have left of the boss if you can see all of their health from the start. In phase 1, Gael's fighting style is beast-like, with him running around on all 4s and throwing out a mix of really delayed attacks and lunges. All of these attacks feel great and are designed specifically to punish you for reactively dodging when he starts his attack. It asks the player to wait for the right amount of time after recognizing the attack to dodge. This horizontal swipe combo where he does one fast swipe and then one super delayed swipe is probably his strangest timing, just because that second swipe comes out so late that it almost seems like he'd stopped attacking. This attack is also so hard to dodge because of how much Gael mixes up and truncates his combos in phase 1. It seems like almost every attack he throws out in neutral has some variation to its follow-up that you have to reactively dodge. This unique quality means that phase 1 never gets stale, which is especially good since you're probably going to have to fight it quite a few times. After taking out half of his phase 1 health, he'll gain a new attack, which is easily his most deadly but also his most punishable. It's a brutal 6-attack combo that ends with a jumping stab that is really difficult to dodge normally. Fortunately, he has a very clear tell with him screaming before starting the attack, so you can easily run out of range and roll in for the punish. This is generally pretty easy to do and basically just free damage, but if you're greedy and overcommit to attacking, it can easily catch you out. Gael's real weakness in this phase is his passiveness. There are a lot of opportunities to just hit him once in neutral and completely get away with it, especially with a fast weapon. If this boss was easier or if the moveset of this phase were worse, I would say that his passiveness was to his detriment, but I think it's really well balanced considering the length of the fight and what's to come. Plus, he's never too passive, like it's not the level of Dancer. It's just the occasional free hit which you usually don't get on the other bosses of this style like Nameless King or Soul of Cinder. Phase 2 is when Gael stands up and starts fighting for real. If the first phase he fought like a beast or a wild animal, in this phase he fights like a knight. He also gains a completely new moveset. Not a single attack from phase 1 is retained. Gael's sword swings now have an X factor in the form of his cape, which follows each of his swings as a second hitbox, making his attacks do far more damage and tightening the dodge window drastically, as you have to clear both the sword and the cape in a single roll. This phase has less variance in his combos. They still have mix-ups, but not nearly as many as phase 1. He generally starts his sword attacks with an overhead swing that he can follow up with a thrust, a spin, or horizontal swipes. Horizontal swipes being by far the scariest, as you have to react really quickly to dodge in the right direction and not get blasted by his cape. The other two are your main openings for damage, and at level 1 it's crucial that you capitalize on them to make this fight shorter and get quicker staggers. Your other openings come in the form of his rarer attacks, like the slow delayed spin that is one of my favorite attacks to dodge in the game, and his spell, the Way of White Corona, which will boomerang back to him on a timer after he throws them, forcing you to get to the other side of him quickly. Side note, this spell is especially cool because it was thought to be lost to time, and Gael is so old that he's the only one who still knows how to cast it. In phase 2 he also gains a new weapon, a fully automatic crossbow that he'll pull on you occasionally. It's basically just a berserk reference, but it's a nice mix-up that you have to react to pretty quickly. Overall, phase 2 is probably Gael's weakest phase. It's not bad by any means, in fact it's really brilliant, but phase 1 and 3 are just that mind-blowingly good. Phase 3 is where Gael really elevates himself above everything else in the game, with absolutely everything going for him. This boss goes from being one of the best to being in a tier of its own. Gael enters phase 3 at just under half health with a massive AoE, followed up by an insane jumping lunge at the player. At the same time this is happening, Gael summons a lightning storm that covers a portion of the arena, becoming an environmental hazard that can stagger you. If phase 1 was animalistic Gael and phase 2 was night Gael, phase 3 is some chimeric abomination of the two, with Gael flip-flopping back and forth between composed swings and flying assaults on the player, while spilling remnants of the Dark Soul. Gael's most frequent combo in this phase is an overhead followed by a spin into a thrust with incredible range, but if dodged correctly it can be a decent damage window. When I say most frequent, that's kind of a misrepresentation of the fight though, as Gael simply possesses so many different moves and variations in this phase that he's constantly doing new and different shit. A flip into his crossbow, a flying lunge into an AoE, 2 jump slashes, his really slow spin attack followed up by a backstep into a lunge. He throws you so many curveballs that you really have to play it by ear and read each attack as it comes. Fortunately, everything is beautifully telegraphed and has immaculate hitboxes, so that's completely doable with some practice. Similarly to the gameplay, the music in this phase is also completely unparalleled. Gwyn's theme is cool, but nothing comes close to Gael's theme in phase 3, which blends so well with the absolutely intoxicating visuals of the fight. There's something truly special about how well everything in and surrounding this boss fight is executed. Everything from the arena to the gameplay is impeccable and synergizes so well together that it's deeply immersing in a way that I've never experienced in a video game. When I first fought this boss, I was absolutely consumed in the fight, 100% locked in, and a nuke could have gone off outside my room and I wouldn't have batted an eye. Slave Knight Gael is the best boss in Dark Souls 3, and he might even be my favorite thing in video games full stop. So do I think Dark Souls 3 is better at level 1? Surprisingly, yes. I mean, it won't be surprising for you because I've been gushing about this the whole time. But before I started and the whole time I was playing, I thought it wasn't better. I thought I'd be saying no. But after I beat it and I looked back on how much I'd gained, how much more I got out of the game than I did playing it normally, I really couldn't deny that this was the superior experience. I don't think it's for everyone, and it's not something for the first playthrough, but even though I'd beaten the game 5 or 6 times before, SL1 made it feel fresh and made it feel new again, and it gave me a greater appreciation for its design. So if you've played Dark Souls 3 before and you don't easily get annoyed, I highly recommend you try beating the game without leveling. Thanks for watching.